Welcome to Class 4, which is the second part of this facial dot removal shot. In this class, I will go into detail the paint window, the paint node, alpha painting options, point tracking for our shot setup, and lastly but not least, I will demonstrate the options for setting up clone sources and the various overlay modes. But first, let's talk about shot approach and jump right in, and I'll play the shot through. To remove the dots, there are a couple possible approaches, either painting out each facial marker individually using point trackers and auto paint, or using offsets with mats, or clean plate paint patches. The first option, using point trackers and auto paint, is the way to go. If I used offsets with mats, then that would be several offsets and layering for each dot since the movement is organic and in all directions, and the blending would be too cumbersome and it might not even produce a quality result. So I'll slow down the clip and we can analyze the movement further. I'm changing the frame rate down here to 12, and we'll play it through a little bit more slowly, and I will zoom in. Part of the issue is that there is not enough identical skin around the dots to make a smooth look with one offset, as it's like a mini patch, but the skin tone, texture, and lighting changes complicate the process. If I used a patch, then I would be fighting against the wrinkling of the skin during the facial animation, as well as lighting changes. I can do a quick check by comparing a couple frames. So I'm just going to go to a frame where I can take a snapshot, so maybe the first frame, around the first frame here. I'll take a snapshot up here with this icon, and then I'm going to go to a different frame in the clip to see how similar or how different it is with the lighting. So I choose this frame, and then I'm going to choose the vertical split up here. And you can see already that even though it looks similar, there is quite a different lighting change right there. So I would have to be animating the lighting change with my patch. And not only that, there's also some blurring, which we'll show you here. Let me get out of the snapshot mode. Some motion blur in these frames. And then we have the wrinkling of the forehead, which is the larger problem. And the specific steps will be to track each dot, apply tracking data to a layer, auto paint out each facial dot using the tracking data, touching up with some hand painting, which is inevitable, and then rendering out the denoised plate, denoised painted frames, comping over only the painted areas with an alpha, and then graining those areas. And then lastly, there's going to be a final render. It's a bit of work, but I chose this plate because this method will give you a lot of practice with auto paint and hand painting, and the more you do it, the better you'll be at it. In my trees window, I have my previously degrained source, and I have a paint node, and I'll be adding nodes as necessary. I'm going to paint in the alpha, so I want to ensure my frames have an alpha channel, and I'll set the fill to transparent. Down here, transparent, which will give me a black alpha. So let's go over the paint node. So this top left green input here is the foreground. And then you have 5 inputs in the middle for other paint sources. So for example, if I wanted to have a blurred paint source, I can attach a blur here. And you can see that now I can paint from a source that is blurred. And over here is the yellow input for the objects. And this is where I can attach a tracker or a roto node. As for the outputs, there is the regular output, which is right here, which outputs the result of the paint node, and the pink output is the paint only output, which is right here. And that will only output the painted portions of the frame along with an automatically generated alpha channel where the brush painted. And in the node parameter window, you have an option of painting a hard or a soft alpha. Right down here, you have the choice here, hard or soft. So I'll demo this real quick. I'm going to switch over here to this other paint node. I'm going to go to the first frame, and I'm going to zoom out. And you can see here, I've painted a couple things. So here in this section over here, I painted with the alpha on. So that means when I'm down in the paint tab here, I have selected A and painted with opaque. And then I also painted this section here with the alpha off. So that was not selected. And if I cycle through the alpha overlay, press the A key, I can see the alpha overlay on the screen. And then if I press the A again, I see the alpha channel. So you can see the result whether you painted with or without A checked. So if we go to the output, you can see that when I'm going to output my paint, I'm going to have my painted areas that you see here. And if I cycle through the alpha, you can see I just have the alpha on showing up in my alpha channel. However, if I did not paint in the alpha, I can still get an alpha channel. If I switch this to the paint only node, you can see that when I'm on the output, that I'm only outputting the areas where I painted. And then I can have the choice of whether I want it to be a soft or a hard alpha. I can click on the paint node here, and I can choose this menu and make that choose that to hard. And then if I go to the output again and I go through the alpha overlay, you can see that now I have a hard alpha. If I go back to the paint node by just clicking on the little lines to the right here, I can still see the output, but I can affect the paint node parameters. I can choose soft, and now you see I have a soft alpha that was painted with opacity. So that's just another option you have, whether you want to output the full frame or just the areas that you painted. And because you see here that you have this large block around your alpha channel with the paint, that's how Silhouette stores its paint. It stores the paint in tiles. Okay, now let's take a look at the viewer controls. I'm going to switch back to the paint node here. And up here on the upper left, you can see I have these different options. So I have output, foreground, color layer, detail layer, and paint. If I switch back to the other paint node, you'll see that I have more options because I have an input. So if I click the menu again, you can see I have output, foreground, input, color layer, detail layer, and paint. And the hotkeys are 1 is the output. So that is if I have painted frames. So here, I'll go back to this node here. So I have painted frames here. Click 1, you can see that's the output. If I click 2, then you can see that's the foreground. Those are the unpainted frames. And then if I go back to this node, if I click 3, you can see that that is my blurred source. And then there's hotkeys 4, 5, 6, 7. And then if I wanted to, there's a few more options. So if I wanted to look at the color layer, I can choose 8. And if I want to look at the detail layer, I can choose 9, click 9. And if I just wanted to see my paint, I can click P. But of course, I'll have to go back to this to see my paint. And there you see I have my painted areas there. So the color and detail tabs are really interesting. I'll click back on the paint node here, and we will go back to our output. And you see down here in the paint tab, you have some different options. The color and detail tabs separate the image into color and detail layers. The color and detail layers can then be painted on separately or simultaneously, and that would be the normal mode. If I click on color, if I press the color button, then I'm only painting color and preserving the detail. And if I press, let's just choose that mode. We can see that up here. Choose 8. So if I'm painting in just the color mode, I'm only painting the color. And if I press the detail button and I go over to the detail view, which is 9, and I do some painting, then I'm only painting on the detail layer and the color is preserved. And the detail selection even has presets you can see if you look at the little pop-up window down here. So these are the different presets: fine, medium, and coarse. And I'm just going to leave this back at the fine details. And click back to the normal mode. So let's get set up for our tracking session. I could use either a roto node or a tracker node in this workflow, but since I'm not using any roto shapes to assist my painting today, I'm going to use a tracker node. So I'm going to bring in a tracker node here. I could either bring it in with the nodes window, or I'm going to click the backtick key, and I'm going to open up the pop-up menu, and I'm going to select it that way. So I'm going to bring in a tracker like that. And I'm going to attach it to my source. And I'm going to disable this input here. I'm actually just going to delete this because I won't be using it. So I'm going to delete that node there. I'm going to attach my tracker, the yellow output, into the input in the paint node. And I'm just going to call this tracker class. You can rename your nodes this way: tracker class. And we're just going to get rid of these nodes over here. We don't need them anymore. But before we get going, since there are so many dots, I'm going to make a reference pick to keep me organized. And I already did that, and I'll show you how. So here I'm going to move over to another part of my trees window, and I can do that by either just panning over the middle mouse, or I can just move this little box down here to this other part of my trees window, which is really handy. So here you can see I needed to label all of these dots because there are so many that I just can't keep track of them, and you're going to have to apply the tracking data to layers. So this is what I decided to do. I just labeled each one. I'll go down to my paint node there, and you can see, I'll zoom in, that I just wrote numbers next to each tracking dot. And then I rendered it out into a reference pick I could use. And then I brought in that reference pick where I could view when I'm setting up my shot. So I'm just going to bring in the reference pick here. I'm going to drag that over. I'm just going to put it up here, and I'm going to put that as an input. So now you can see if I am tracking my shot and I'm not sure which dot it is, I can look at it. So no matter where I am when I'm doing my painting, and I'm in my output mode, if I click on 3, I can easily see which dot is which. So now I'm going to turn off this node viewer here by clicking this button up on the top of the trees window. And I can see my tree a little more clearly. And we'll start the tracking process. I'm going to click on my tracker node here, and I'm going to insert a point tracker. I want to make sure I'm on the point tracker tab down here in the tracker window. So I might just start with 1. If I click the Alt key at my cursor, that here is where my tracker is going to be placed. So the parts of the point tracker are you have the actual track point here, and then you have these match area. So you want to encompass the whole area that you want to match when you're tracking, which is the dot. And then you have the search region, which is the dotted area. This region is the area where the tracker is going to search as it goes from frame to frame. If you have a large movement in your shot, like you can see that the head moves quite a bit, you want to have a tracking region that is going to accommodate that kind of movement. If you had a really tiny movement, it was just kind of, he was barely moving, then you could just leave the search region pretty small. But in this case, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. And then I'm going to look at my pre-processing to see if that's going to help me. I'm going to click on the preview button. And now you can see here, this is the preview of what I'm going to be tracking. And I could just up the contrast a little bit. It's already a degrained plate, so that's going to help me as well. The noise won't be interfering with the tracking process. And I really like to track with the behavior set to every frame. You can use start frame and that works well, but I'm sort of a fan of every frame. It could take a little bit longer with the processing, and every frame is a little bit like if what you are tracking changes in appearance a little bit, it's going to just use the every frame to help it get through the tracking. And I like to use this if I have frames where my area that I'm tracking gets a little bit blurred. It seems to stay on track a little bit better. So I'll click off the preview, and we'll just track the marker. So that worked out pretty well. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to make sure that my point stayed in relatively the same place the whole time when I'm tracking. I wouldn't want my tracker dot is in the middle of the facial dot. If it had moved to the top of the dot at some point or the lower part, I would want to change that or retrack it, because when I'm doing my clone painting, it's going to have to be centered right on exactly where that tracking dot is. And so while we're just going to be doing straightforward point tracking here, Silhouette's point tracker is really versatile. I'm going to go up to the user guide here, the help menu, user guide, and I'm going to search point tracker. And I'm just going to arrow down my arrow keys here, and I'm going to go to the section where I can learn a little bit more about the point tracker. And I happen to know this is the section. So on page 144, you can see that it gives the instructions on how to use the point tracker, how to move the tracking components, scaling, and then you can also do offset tracking. You can merge trackers, average trackers, 1 point, 2 point, 4 point tracking. It's really like tracking on steroids, really. It's a great point tracker. So I'm going to close this out. And we'll go back to our tracking. So here you see my tracker node. I have my tracker 33 inside my object list. I've done some tracking before. That's why it says 33. But I'm going to label this tracker as 1, since I know that is my tracker 1. And then I'm going to apply my tracking to a layer. And that's how we're going to use auto paint and clone painting. I'm going to click on the add layer button here. And I'm going to call this layer 1. Hit return. I'm going to select the tracker and the layer, holding down the shift key. And then in the point tracker window, I'm going to click apply. And then you can see, since I just have 1 point, I'm going to click OK. If I had multiple points, then you would have other options such as scaling and rotation. So the target layer is layer 1. Click OK. And now I can see in my timeline that my tracking is applied to my layer. So let's do a few more point tracks and then we'll do some painting. I won't be able to go through the entire shot with all of the tracking and all the painting in this class, but we'll try to get a couple of things done. Let's go back to the tracker mode. I'm going to zoom out. And let's pick another dot. Let's try this one here in the little crease on the side of his mouth. And I'm going to insert a track marker. Alt, click, and now you can see I'm going to zoom in to get a little bit better placement. And we'll track. Okay, and let's do another one. We can start the end frame. It doesn't matter where we start. I like to start at a frame where it's relatively clear and not super blurred. So we'll just add another track marker here. Make sure that's in the center. And I'll do every frame, not keyframes, but every frame. And I'll just track backwards. And now we need to go back and we need to name our trackers and attach them to layers. So let's go back to this tracker and to figure out which tracker this is. I'm going to click 3. First, I'm going to be on the paint node. Okay, now I can see that that is 18. So I'm going to go back to my tracker node here. So this tracker 33 is 18. I'm going to label that 18. I'm going to create a layer. I'm going to call that layer 18. I'm going to select this layer and the tracker 18. They're not next to each other, but I can just click the command key. They're both selected, apply, and OK. And then we have one down here. We have to attach that one. We'll take a look, and that's 25. OK, tracker 25. Layer 25. Apply, and then we're done. So I'm not going to go through tracking every single facial dot, but I will show you my result after I did finish tracking every dot. We're going to go over here to my final tree here, and in my tracker node, you can see, and I'll just pull this up here, all of my layers and all of my trackers. And if I scrub through the timeline, you can see how they were all tracked. But for now, we're going to go back to our tree. I'm going to click that on, and I'm just going to navigate back over to our class nodes. And I'm going to turn and disable that, visibility icon right there. And we'll click on to the paint node. And I'm going to make sure I am on the output node. I'm in input 1 with the view, and we'll just make sure I'm in the output. I'm just going to zoom in here a little bit. So you can already see I'm in the clone tool. Over here on the left side here, we have the toolbar here, all the different brushes. And I'm in the clone tool here, and C is the hotkey. And before we go any further, I'm just going to save my file, Command S, and we'll start by opening up the paint preferences. And you can do that by going to the Silhouette Preferences menu there, or you can click on this little button down here in the Paint tab, and that brings up the preferences. You can see I have my brush outline color set to pink, and I have my source cursor, source outline color here, set to green. So keeping them separate colors helps me remember which is what. And the reason why I set my brush outline cursor to pink is because the word pink starts with the letter P, and P is also the first letter of paint. So that helps me remember when I'm painting what is my source cursor and what is my painting cursor. And then I'm going to change one thing before we start. Right now my crosshair cursor is set to on, right up here, and I'm going to change it to off. This way I don't see the larger black and white cursor crosshair in the middle of my brush, so it does not obstruct what I can see when I'm painting. And you also have the option of on and off. And with that option, the black and white cursor is on, but when you paint, it disappears. So that's all we're going to change right now. I'm going to click Apply, OK, and we're back in our session. And as a general rule, I disable subpixel. Down here, you can see this parameter in the paint window, as I find it makes my painting too soft. It is useful on occasion if I need an ultra-precise lineup, though. And I also have A clicked over here and opaque in the paint tab, so I can see my alpha paint. And it's fine that that the opaque is turned on when I also click A, because I want that to be white. And if I paint with opacity, the alpha is also painted with opacity. But the defaults are off. So I'll show you, for example, if I click the backtick key, I'm going to bring in another paint node. And you can see here, if I'm on the clone tool, click C, that subpixel is by default on, and A and opaque are not clicked. So you just want to make sure that you have everything set up before you start. So I'm just going to delete this node because we don't need it. And we'll just get started with some painting. I'm going to zoom in here. And I'm going to focus on this dot here that we've already tracked. So the clone brush, as titled, essentially clones pixels sampled from a potential variety of source options, whether it be the same frame, a different frame, or a completely different source input. And any source can be manipulated by the tools in the clone brush window tabs down here. So there are three things that you need to do when you're starting out cloning. One, you need to choose your source. And for this exercise, the source is either going to be the output or the foreground, and I'm not really going to use any of the inputs, and I'm mostly going to be on output. And if I'm on output, it means that when I'm painting, I'm building and painting on top of the work I've already done. And you can see down here, this is where you're going to choose your source. So I'm selected on output. And then you need to choose the frame. So you can see here I am on the first frame here, and my frame is the same frame. And I've actually set some presets here, and I'll go through these presets really quickly. So I have the preset 1 here. It's all the same type of brush, by the way. So I'm at a size 50, an opacity of 100, a softness of 80. That's what I found works best, at least for the softness, for doing the auto paint. And then over here, I'm mostly going to be on this preset here, and 0 I have saved to just to be the same frame. And up here, 1, 2, 3, 4, I have made 1 the frame before, 2 the frame after. You can see it's changing there. 3 2 frames before. You can't see it because I'm on the first frame, but let's go to a later frame. And now you can see the frame before, the frame after, 2 frames before, and 2 frames after. And that's going to help me later on after I've done my auto paint, and maybe I want to pull frames from before or after a certain area. And I can just use the presets here, and I can either click on the presets. First I will get out of the clone, the overlay right now. And if I click Alt-1, Alt-2, Alt-3, Alt-4, or Alt-0, you can see that's how I can toggle through my presets. But right now I'm just going to save on 0, which is the same frame. So I've chosen my frame, and now I need to make an offset. I'm going to zoom in even a little bit more here. Zoom in. And I'm going to make my brush smaller using the Command key. And I'm going to set my clone offset. So there's a couple different ways to set your clone offset. One way is that you hold down the Shift key, click, and then drag. And then when I'm painting from my source, which is the green cursor. Another way to do it, and I'll just Command Z out of this, is to hold down the Shift key and click, and then click again. So it's either Shift, click, and drag, or Shift, click, and click. And I'll just Command Z to get out of that. So let me just set another offset here to show you something. So Shift, click, and I'm painting. So now I'm going to click an overlay mode. So there's 4 different modes here where you can view different frames compared with each other. So this is the onion skin mode, and this is probably the most popular way to do this. So you can see when I click on and off, it's overlaying the 2 frames with a 50% opacity. You can change this value if you like. And then you have the align mode, and this is the button for that. And that puts your image into more of a grayscale mode. So when things are perfectly lined up, you will see a flat color. So in this case, it's not quite lined up. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to zoom out. And it's flat. If I'm on a different frame here, you can see, well, it's harder to line up. I can just use the arrow keys. So I don't really use the align mode, but it is helpful, for example, if I want to use subpixel. If I turn on subpixel down here and I'm moving my cursor, you can see that these offset values are moving at an increment lower than 1. And then I can get a closer match, a subpixel match, if I need that for painting. But it will possibly make your image a little bit blurrier when you're painting. So it's just something to keep in mind. And I'll just disable that. And I'll go back to the regular overlay and turn off subpixel. And now you can see that my values are set to increments of 1. So then there are a couple other ways to also set your source. I'm going to click the overlay off here. And one way to do it is by using the keys Q, W, and E. Q is translate, W is rotate, and E is scale. By pressing one of these keys, you're automatically put into the onion skin overlay. So I'll press the Q key, and now you can see I'm in overlay. Let's go to a frame where we can see a difference. Okay, it'll be easier to see on this frame. I'm just going to press the Q key, and that is the translate. And I can move things around with my cursor by holding down on the tablet. I can use the arrow keys to move things up and down or sideways. If I hold down the Shift key, it moves the source in increments of 10, or however you have that set inside your preferences. And then if I press W, that's the rotate key, and you can see where I'm pressing W, that becomes my pivot. And I can rotate around my source. I can use the arrow keys. If I'm rotating by holding down the pen, I can hold down the Command key, and it's a finer tuning there for the rotating. And then we have the scaling as well, which is E, and you can scale your source as you like. And then to get out of this mode, just press the E key again, or whatever modifier you were in. If you were in rotate, just press the W key again, and you're out of it. And if you press the caps lock, you can see that that is where, that's how your offset is set for your source. So I'm going to reset that down here, and we will also try the interactive mode. So if I click this button down here, interactive, now you can see I have overlays on the screen. So in this manner, you can see where you can actually drag, touch these controls up here to affect your source frame. So here I'm going to skew my source frame in that direction, or I can skew it in this direction. I can rotate my source. If I hold down the period key and I'm hovered over, then that will now be my pivot point. And then here you have the scaling, and then just moving around, and you have the corner pin boxes up here as well. So you can see I have this white cursor up here. Just make sure that you are out of the interactive mode once you start painting. If I'm in here and I'm moving around and then I'm outside where you can see the black cursor, I'm painting, and you don't want to do that. You can see that paint strokes were made inside the paint history. So you just want to make sure that you've got your source all lined up how you like it. Let's just try to get that lined up how you might want it, even though we probably want it more like this if I'm painting out this dot here. So that's how you set up your overlay, your clone source with the interactive on-screen tools. And then to click off, you just check this button here, and then you can start painting. So that's done. And then you can see I can paint like that. And then lastly, there's a couple other different ways you can affect your source. So we're in the clone tab here, but you can also be in the grade and filter, and you can change the color of your source that you want to match. You can also blur it or sharpen it. And sometimes I find the sharpen really helpful if I'm painting along and an area is getting a little too soft. I can just set my source to have a little more sharpening and then pull that through, and that's a great tip. And then in the clone tool, we also have an option to have a dual clone brush, and that takes that paints with two offsets at the same time at a certain opacity. So if I can set an opacity or an offset with 1 and 2, and then if I click dual, I'll have 3 cursors. The one in the middle, that's the painting one, and then I have the different offsets. So you can see here, if I click on 1 and I set an offset here, like that, and then if I click on 2 and I set another offset like that, and then I'm on dual, you can see that I have 2 cursors that I'm going to be painting with, just like that. So that's really handy. It might not be as handy for this exercise, but I definitely use it all the time. But we'll just click out of there for now, and we'll get started on our regular work. First, I'm going to get rid of these paint strokes here. You can see that I've done some painting. And when you paint, you can see that you have a red tick on the timeline. So these are just practice strokes. I'm going to select this, and I'm just going to delete by pressing the trash can here. And then, yes, I want to rebuild. And then we have our dots back. Okay, so this concludes class 4. The next class will be focused primarily on painting and then finishing up with regraining.